thank you very much, everybody, for being here. It's a tremendous pleasure myself to be here. I am going to talk about a book that I'm writing with Robert Shiller called Phishing for Fools. So this is meant to be a popular book. There are rules. As an economist, you're not supposed to write popular books. You're supposed to. So there are rules of what can and cannot be published in economics, and those rules leave holes. There are valid and important things to say, but there's no way to say them that's acceptable in any journal. For example, quite a few economists thought the derivatives would lead to the current crisis, but economists could not figure out a way to express those views in the form of a paper. Now, because of the rules for what could be published, those papers were not written, and so it was ignored. And because it was ignored, we had the financial crisis. And of course, the financial crisis is the central event in the history of our times. So with that preface, let me begin. The world's most powerful social and economic tool is the free global market. It enables the world's adults to trade with one another. Worldwide, there's some 25 quinquillion possible pairs of buyers and sellers. And as you can see up there, a quinquillion or even 25 quinquillion is really quite a big number. I can't count the number of zeros from here. The selection that this huge amount of choice affords to both buyers and sellers makes us all better off. But then, yet more important are new ideas. Billions of new ideas are naturally adopted by free markets year after year, and they make us better off. Because of this technical change, our older retirees, both in Canada and the US, were born in countries that were poorer than present-day Mexico. Now, markets are capable of such power for good because they allow so much positive selection. But not all, so here's where Phishing for Fools comes in. So the markets are wonderful, that's the first message. But not all of those ideas are good for you and good for me. Some of those ideas are good for you, but they're bad for me. And associated with such ideas come the tricks to inveigle me into buying in. So markets then do the following. They aim for our weak spots. They seek out and take aim for our emotional or cognitive weaknesses. They seek to block our channels of information and then take advantage of those weaknesses. So what does this mean? Markets do not just enable such phishing for fools. Markets inevitably do so as long as there's a profit to be made. So that's the basic principle of economics. If there's a profit to be made on something, then that's going to happen. And so the story here is that phishing for fools is inevitable, and this, in fact, is what happens. So what is phishing? Phish is a recent word. It's computerese. Now, free markets open us up to those who seek to influence us to do what they want, but that's not necessarily good for ourselves. They allow us, in other words, to be phished. So, as I said before, we live in a world where some 5 billion adults can phish us for being a fool. So we've intentionally opened ourselves up to such exploitation. We've done so because of the obvious advantages. But then we must also think about the other side of that bargain. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. I'm going to give you 3 examples which show that phishing for fools is deeply embedded. It's deeply embedded in our economy, and then furthermore, it plays a major role in our lives. Okay? So, health. So here's an example. In the United States, 3/4 of all adults are overweight. Yet worse, 1/3 are not just overweight, but obese. So free markets, they help us with this a little bit. They give us Weight Watchers. They give us vegetables. We can buy tomatoes, I think, and Diet Coke and Pepsi. And those are some help to those of us who are concerned about our weight. But if you go to almost any mall, any place in the country, there will be the smell of those Cinnabons. And those Cinnabons are going to be waiting for you. I think maybe I've got a picture of a Cinnabon here. Yes, there's a Cinnabon. Okay, that smell, like a moth's pheromones, is a call to all of us overweight, obese people. So just to give you some statistics, between 1970 and 2003, the US daily food calorie intake increased by 23.4%. 480 of those 523 calories increase were in fats and oils and grains and sugars. Now, Cinnabon here, Cinnabon is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the temptations that the market strews in our path. Okay, so that's one example of phishing for fools. Okay, so now that takes us to the next example. People, for the most part, seem to have a hard time saving, okay? And this is Susie Orman. You probably are familiar with Susie Orman, who gives financial advice on TV. And if you're not familiar, you can get the picture. So when I asked an economist friend of mine about her, he had the predictable reaction. He said he could not stand her mommy knows best voice, and he had seen her for only 10 seconds and had switched her off. Okay. But that doesn't explain a puzzle. That does not explain why Orman's audiences lap her up. So our most popular book has the following title. It's called The 9 Steps to Financial Freedom, Practical Steps So You Can Stop Worrying. And I underlined worrying there. So let's contrast what she tells us there with the portrait given of consumer spending in the economics textbooks. Well, I don't know. If you've read the economics textbooks, we go to the supermarket and we have a budget. We have a budget for how much we're going to spend on those apples and oranges. Now with that budget, we purchase the combination of apples and oranges that maximizes our happiness. But Susie Orman's financial advice books tell us that consumers do not follow such a textbook protocol in their purchases. So how could consumers do anything other than that than what the textbooks decide? I'm an economist. Actually, I think I probably do this rational thing. But Orman's people don't. She tells us that people have emotional hang-ups with regard to money and with regard to spending it. She says they're not honest with themselves, and as a consequence, they do not engage in rational budgeting. So how could she possibly know? Well, she has a test. She's a financial advisor. When she asked her financial advisees to add up their expenditures, those expenditures invariably fall far short of what documented records later turn up. Figuratively, relative to the proverbial trip to the supermarket to buy apples and oranges, it's as if her advisees spend too much time in the fruit section, and by the time they reach dairy products, there's nothing left over for the eggs and the milk. In real life, such budgetary failure translates into having nothing left over for savings. This failure to deal cognitively and emotionally with money, says Orman, leads to those unpaid bills. So it's her mission. It's her mission. She's a good person to keep those bills down so that her readers and her clients will no longer worry at night. And it's worth noting parenthetically, at least, that worries are central concerns of financial advice books, but they're far into economics textbooks. I've never found the word worry in the index to an economics book. So I'm going to just give you two examples of the fact that this applies to most consumers. For British workers who are paid once a month, expenditures are down 20% on average by the day before their next paycheck. In the United States, approximately 20 to 25% of all US residents will go bankrupt over the course of their lifetime. Okay. So there's a theoretical puzzle. Why are there all those sleepless nights with worries about unpaid bills? Well, back in 1930, John Maynard Keynes wrote an essay on what life would be like for our grandchildren, what's presumably 100 years later. He predicted correctly that by now, income would have increased some 6 times. And he was correct on that. But in another respect, he was way off the mark. He said that we would all be feeling so rich that the work week would fall to 15 hours. We would spend most of our time in leisure. But our book, coupled with Susie Orman, explains why Keynes' predictions were wrong. So here's the answer to the puzzle. Okay. The goal of almost every business person is to get you to spend your money. Life is a proverbial trip to a parking lot in which you're constantly passing spaces left open for the disabled. Life in a capitalist economy is then a continual temptation. So just think about it. Just walk down any city street. Those shop windows are literally there to make you come in and buy. That is the purpose of a shop window. So you probably all know this song about how much is the doggy in the window. So probably everybody listens. So that doggy is sitting in the window, and it's supposed to entice you to come in and buy. And so that's what this is all about. You know what you know how that song, people probably know the first verse of that, but you probably don't know what happens in the second verse. The girl is walking down the street, she sees the nice doggy in the window, and she says she's going to go in and buy. Not only is she going to buy that doggy, but she's going to do something utterly outrageous. She's not going to buy it for herself. She's going to take it home for her boyfriend, which might be perfectly fine, but she's going to leave for California. So that's what happens there. So that's what those shop windows do. In the shopping mall, in the supermarket, everywhere, temptation is there asking you to buy. These invitations, these attempts to lure us, they're simply pervasive. And so most of us, in this richest of all ages, go to bed at night worried about paying the bills. Okay, so that's a second example of phishing for fools. The financial crisis, okay? Well, there are hundreds of books on the financial crisis, and the typical book is 500 pages long, and there's been a great deal of wonderful reporting on this. Typical book then tells the story of my institution, for example. People write about Lehman or Goldman Sachs or Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or the Fed, the Treasury, the Bank of America, Citicorp, et cetera. And then this nice reporter who's gone into all the details says that my institution is central to the crisis. But I'm going to tell this in less than 3 minutes, and in the book it's 12 pages. Okay? So if I have a reputation for selling perfect, beautiful avocados, then I have an opportunity. I can sell you a rotten avocado at the price you would pay for the perfect ripe one. What will I have done? I will have mined my reputation, but not only will I mine my reputation, but I've also will have fished you for a fool. Such a story lies at the heart of the continuing financial crisis that dominates the economics of our times. The reputation and mining in question involved the subversion of the system for rating fixed income securities. The reputations of Moody's and Standard & Poor's had been built up painstakingly over the course of almost a century. Their job was to rate bonds on their probability for default. But then, as you all know, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the ratings agencies took on themselves the task not just of rating bonds, but also of rating more complex derivative securities. The complexity of the payment structures made them nearly impossible to rate. But then, the public would believe whatever ratings were given to them by the agencies. And so an industry grew up. An industry grew up to do a reputation mine. Okay? So those are those wonderful avocados that were being rated. Okay? So by analogy, rotten avocados were being labeled perfect. With that label, they commanded premium prices. And so a central valley full of growers went into the profitable business of producing such avocados. So this mining of the ratings is the basic story of the financial crisis. Now, that's not all of the explanation, and I'm going to just give you what's the rest of it, just very briefly collapse it. Financial institutions bought these securities, and then they borrowed on them. For the moment, those securities seemed as good as gold, and because the ratings indicated there was almost no chance of default. But then, as you can imagine, the truth was discovered. Those avocados, perfect as they were on the outside, were really rotten. They were really rotten on the inside. So, from Frankfurt to New York to Reykjavik, financial institutions owed much more than they owned, and without bailout, they were bankrupt. Okay, so I'm just giving you a handful of the many, many, many examples that we're going to have in this book, Phishing for Fools. Now, what's the purpose of this book? The purpose of this book is to give an economics which is in a different key. It's not a major key, it's a minor key. The two greatest economic mistakes of the past 20 years, the European Monetary Union and deregulation of financial derivatives, occurred because economists were not sufficiently skeptical. We were not sufficiently skeptical of what happened in markets. We were not sufficiently skeptical of our own logic. So what the book is meant to do, in general, is to teach us to be appropriately skeptical. But at the same time, remember I started with telling you about how markets were really wonderful, and they really give us lots of the things, good things that we have. But so at the same time, it also gives an appropriate vision of how the good is mixed with the bad. So the purpose of the book is to teach us to be skeptical, but not to be cynical. Okay. Thank you very much.